Din Vo, and Nguyen for organizing a fantastic conference program. This is actually the 20th anniversary of my first Texas Tech Vietnam War Symposium, which was back in 2005 when it was at the Holodome. And I was a graduate student trying to find my way in the world of Vietnam War history. What struck me then and continues to now is the diversity of perspectives that Texas Tech's Vietnam War conferences always welcome, even at the risk of the occasional heated argument. Acknowledging conflicting viewpoints and challenging conventional wisdom is something that this conference has always done well. And I thank Texas Tech for creating a space where historians, veterans, activists, writers, and others, Vietnamese and American, have come together to try and make sense of a conflict that still affects us today. The theme of this session is abandoning Vietnam, which itself is a controversial topic. What do we mean when we talk about abandoning Vietnam? Did the US abandon its ally, the Republic of Vietnam? Did it abandon a nation-building project? Did the US abandon the idea that America had a responsibility to protect the so-called free world? When did the US abandon Vietnam? Was it when Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho held secret meetings during the Paris peace talks and didn't invite Nguyen Van Tu? Was it when American combat troops withdrew from South Vietnam? Or when President Gerald Ford extended the trade embargo against North Vietnam to cover all of Vietnam? What does abandonment look like from the viewpoints of ARVN soldiers and officers, Hanoi and Saigon leaders, and US military advisors? Our distinguished panelists are going to offer some thoughts on the topic of abandoning Vietnam, and it is my pleasure to introduce them. Dr. Andrew Wiest, seated in the center here, is University Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Southern Mississippi and has served as a visiting senior lecturer at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in the United Kingdom and as a visiting professor in the Department of Warfighting Strategy at the United States Air Force Air War College. Dr. Reese is the founding director of the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society and the founding co-director of the Center for the Study of the National Guard at Southern Miss. Dr. Reese has published widely and presented his research at conferences and at invited talks both nationally and internationally. Dr. Reese has published more than 20 books, including The Boys of '67, Charlie Company's War in Vietnam, and Vietnam's Forgotten Army, Heroism and Betrayal in the ARVN, which won the Society for Military History's Distinguished Book Award. He has also been nominated for an Emmy Award for his work on National Geographic Channel's documentary, Brothers in War, which was based on his book, The Boys of '67, and won a New York Festival's Gold Medal for his work on the History Channel documentary, Vietnam in HD. His new book, Dogwood, A National Guard Unit's War in Iraq, is due out in May with Osprey Bloomsbury. Dr. James H. Willbanks is Professor Emeritus of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He retired from CGSC in April 2018 after 49 years of combined federal service. For 2 years prior to retiring, Dr. Willbanks served as the General of the Army George C. Marshall Chair of Military History. Dr. Willbanks joined the CGSC faculty in 1992 when he retired from the Army as a lieutenant colonel with 23 years service as an infantry officer, including a tour as an infantry advisor with the South Vietnamese Regiment during the 1972 North Vietnamese Easter Offensive. He also served in the 3rd Infantry, 7th Infantry, 9th Infantry, 1st Cavalry, and U.S. Southern Command. Prior to assuming the Marshall Chair, he served as director of the CGSC Department of Military History for 11 years. Before that, he taught national security policy and counterinsurgency in the Department of Joint and Multinational Operations. Dr. Willbanks holds a BA in history from Texas A&M University and an MA and PhD in history from the University of Kansas. Was I supposed to say Gig'em, or is that gonna make people upset?
I'll take care of that.
Go Red Raiders. He is an honor graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College and the inaugural class of the School of Advanced Military Studies. He is the author or editor of 22 books, including Abandoning Vietnam, How America Left and South Vietnam Lost Its War, and The Tet Offensive, A Concise History. Dr. Willbanks is a former two-term trustee in the Society for Military History, is on the editorial board of the Modern War Studies series for University Press of Kansas, the editorial board of Vietnam Magazine, and the History Advisory Committee of ABC Clio Publishing. He and his work have been highlighted in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, U.S. News and World Report, Wall Street Journal, Army Times, Stars and Stripes, the History Channel, C-SPAN, PBS, and several international history journals. He served as a consultant to Ken Burns and appeared on camera numerous times throughout the 10-part, 18-hour documentary on the Vietnam War for PBS, which began airing in the fall of 2017. Dr. George J. Veith is a former U.S. Army captain who served in armor units in the United States and Germany from 1979 to 1986. He earned his Ph.D. in history from Monash University and is the author of 5 books on the Vietnam War. They include Codename Bright Light, The Untold Story of U.S. POW Rescue Efforts During the Vietnam War, Leave No Man Behind, Bill Bell and the Search for American POW MIAs from the Vietnam War, Black April, The Fall of South Vietnam, 1973 to 1975, Drawn Swords in a Distant Land, South Vietnam's Shattered Dreams, and most recently, Peace, POWs, and Power, Reflections on the Vietnam War. Dr. Veith also published an ebook with the Woodrow Wilson Center titled The Return to War, North Vietnamese Decision-Making, 1973 to 1975. He has testified before Congress, spoken at dozens of events on the POW MIA accounting mission, and presented numerous papers at scholarly conferences on the Vietnam War. He is currently working on a history of how North Vietnam won the war. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleagues, who will each speak for about 10 minutes on the issue of abandoning Vietnam from their own research. Dr. Willbanks' experiences as an ARVN advisor and his subsequent research on the war, Dr. Reese's work on ARVN and the military history of the Vietnam War, and Dr. Veith's research on the end of the war, as well as DRV and PAVN perspectives. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Willbanks.
Thank you. My comments are going to be from a personal perspective as opposed to a historian's perspective. My travel to Vietnam was a bit circuitous. I was commissioned at Texas A&M in 1969, thinking I was going to Vietnam immediately, ended up going to Germany. Frankly, Germany in the early 70s was not a great place to be, so I volunteered to go to Vietnam. I will tell you that was a decision that I revisited several times in the following year. So at that particular point, there were only 4 U.S. battalions left in country, so I was going to be an advisor, so the Army sent me to the MATA ARVN course at Fort Bragg, and then to Vietnamese language school at Fort Bliss, because only the U.S. Army would send you to El Paso to learn Vietnamese. And as you might suspect, my Vietnamese language skills are somewhat suspect, to say the least. I arrived in December of 1971 at Camp Alpha in Saigon. The ever-present sergeant with a clipboard looked at me and said, "Captain, why are you here? The war is over." I soon lived to find that that was not true. Having been trained as an advisor for the ARVN, the Army sent me to be an advisor with the Royal Thai Army in Vietnam. It's the Army after all. After a very short stint with them, because they were in the process of withdrawing like the U.S. troops, I was assigned as a battalion advisor with the 48th Infantry Regiment, 18th ARVN Division, based at Long Giao, the old Black Horse Base Camp, 11th ACR Base Camp, in Long Con Province, 3 Corps Tactical Zone. For the first couple of months after I got there, we ran routine patrols in the jungle surrounding our base camp. We only had 1 significant firefight during that time, of which I was wounded the first time. But on 30 March, everything changed. That, of course, was the day that the PAVN launched a massive attack against the ARVN positions south of the DMZ and I Corps Tactical Zone. And this was followed by similar attacks in the Central Highlands and then in Bien Long Province and 3 Corps. This was all part of what became known, obviously, as the North Vietnamese Eastern Offensive, a massive 3-pronged offensive during which the PAVN committed 14 divisions and 28 separate regiments, a total of more than 130,000 troops. On 7 April, the 5th Pavan Division overran Loc Ninh, a district capital belonging to Bin Long Province, between Snool, Cambodia, and An Loc. On 12 April, I flew up into An Loc and joined Task Force 52, which was a 2-battalion task force that was attached, it was actually from the 18th ARBN, but it was attached to the 5th ARBN, which was the controlling headquarters for the battle. The next morning, tanks of the Pavan 203rd Tank Regiment and elements of the 9th Pavan Division attacked the city in force. And that launched a battle that went on for the better part of 3 months. Ultimately, the ARBN and An Loc, numbering about 6,500 at the highest point, were surrounded by 3 Pavan divisions, which totaled about 35,000 enemy troops. The city was cut off from outside reinforcement from that point forward. The fighting was intense, much more intense than certainly I had ever experienced, and most everyone else as well in their experience. The ARBN held out against massive artillery barrages. It is estimated that 78,000 artillery rounds fell on Loc Ninh, An Loc, and along Highway QL-13 south of the city during a 3-month siege. It also sustained, the city came under repeated tank and infantry attacks, while the enemy was pounded by B-52s, fighter bombers, Spectre gunships, and Army Cobra attack helicopters. The battle was a very near thing. The ARBN sustained 2,300 KIA in the fighting, but the survivors held on doggedly as the air power, US and VNAF, pounded the enemy. The road to the south was finally cleared of enemy in late summer, and the siege was broken. Much needed reinforcements began to flow into the city. Elsewhere, the ARBN in Kon Tum in the Central Highlands held, and Quang Tri, which had fallen earlier in the summer, was retaken in September after a long and bloody fight. There is no doubt that air power was one of the decisive factors in the victories at An Loc, Kon Tum, and Quang Tri. For example, more than 7,000 close air support sorties and B-52 strikes were flown in support of the ARBN at An Loc in April and May alone. However, the bottom line is that the South Vietnamese stood and took all the North Vietnamese could throw at them for the better part of 3 months and prevailed under almost unbelievable conditions. Perhaps General Creighton Abrams, Comus MacVie said it best, quote, "I doubt the fabric of this thing, the ARBN defense, could have been held together without U.S. air. But the thing that had to happen before that is Vietnamese had to stand and fight. If they didn't do that, 10 times the air would not have stopped the NVA." I was wounded for the second time in An Loc on 9 July, as a matter of fact, but I remained in country after a 3-week stay at Third Field Hospital. I wanted to make sure I got credit for a full tour before I went home. I departed Vietnam on 4 December 72. I thought that the South Vietnamese, based upon their performance during the Easter Offensive, and it's very hard for me to describe what it was like, unbelievable conditions. I thought they stood a very good chance of surviving on their own with all U.S. troops departed, but it was clear that U.S. support would be crucial to that survival, as it had been during the Easter Offensive. Little did I know that support would not be forthcoming when it was most needed. I have since read the documentation on the many promises that were made, and frankly, as an advisor, I've always been embarrassed with the outcome, that we should have been there when we were most needed. This completes my comments. Thank you.
I love me some Jim Willbanks. So he's a hard guy to follow. Thank y'all for being here this morning. From my side of things, I want to look at the abandonment of Vietnam. Through the research I had done and the stories that I had told in the book, Vietnam's Forgotten Army, Heroism and Betrayal. In the ARBN, if you're familiar with that book, you can just go to sleep. You've already heard this. If you're not familiar with the book, it's about 2 of ARBN's bright, shining junior leaders. This is their rank at the end of their careers, Lieutenant Colonel Phan Van Den and Lieutenant Colonel Tran Ngoc Hue, with oral histories made with them being my main source. So my goal here is to give some thoughts on the end of the war, especially through their eyes, since they were at the sharp Arvind's end of the stick of battle. Wiest's vantage point at the end of the war was a sad one. He had been badly wounded and captured during the Lam Son 719 invasion of Laos. He was incarcerated in North Vietnam and was constantly urged to defect by his captors, but remained true to the vision of the Republic of Vietnam. In 1973, with the prisoner exchange, he was brought to the river that runs in the middle of the DMZ, was actually given a chance to see his family from afar before he was told that since he was captured in Laos, he wasn't eligible for prisoner exchange. So he remained in prison and then at re-education camps until 1983, 12 years after his capture. After that, he remained under house arrest until he eventually moved to the United States in 1991. The sad end to the Vietnam War cost Tran Ngoc Way, his wife, and their 3 beautiful daughters much of their adult lives. The family eventually went on to prosper in the U.S., but the scars remained. So here I would argue that we see an example of the cost paid by our abrupt departure from Vietnam. Tran Ngoc Way had fought hard, he'd never given up, and he deserved better. But through it all, he never blamed America for any of his troubles. In fact, today, he's probably the most patriotic American that I could say it's my pleasure to have ever met. The story of Pham Van Dien, though, is infamously quite different. He commanded an Arvin regiment atop Camp Carroll during the Easter Offensive of 1972. He was without doubt at that point in time one of the most stellar young officers that Arvin had to offer, having received the Silver Star for his fighting at Hue City in '68 and commanded troops that had been the first to the top of Hamburger Hill. He, like Tran Ngoc Way, had great hopes that Arvin would come of age with the Americans acting as their shield during a formative time, and victories in Tet, victories in Cambodia, and even victories in Laos had seemed to indicate to him that he was correct. But that view changed atop Camp Carroll. He was there with about 500 soldiers, was surrounded by about 10,000 enemy soldiers when the NVA called him, told him to surrender or be wiped out. A chopper came in to rescue his American advisors, but there was no chopper for him and his men. He telephoned his corps commander, General Lam, to ask about relief plans. Lam's abrupt response was that he was late for a tennis match. He couldn't help Dien out and he had to figure it out for himself. Although it was 1972 and not 1975, as Dien sat there atop Camp Carroll, he felt abandoned. His feeling was that the Americans were leaving, never to return, and his feeling was, given what General Lam had told him about being late for a tennis match, that the South Vietnamese government also had no answer for him at that point. In Dien's view, it was time to surrender, and then he, of course, also made a very difficult decision to defect to the enemy. It was interesting in those many years that I had to get Dien to the United States to interview him. The Vietnamese government was not going to allow him to talk about his experience as an Arvin officer. It was also interesting that in the U.S., Dien wanted to make a public presentation at my university where he was going to more or less, I knew what he was going to say, more or less apologize for his actions, but that attempt to speak was quashed. Americans didn't want to hear what he had to say. So at the end, Dien felt alone, that the Vietnamese didn't accept him, and neither did the Americans. Perhaps punishment worthy of a traitor. That's up to you. But our interviews were quite revealing about Arvin was, about what it wasn't, and about his role in it. And while talking about it, he came alive. He only became more pensive when it neared time to talk about his surrender and his decision to change sides. He was going to have to confess his shortcomings publicly. But right before we discussed Camp Carroll, he looked at me and asked me the most powerful question I've ever received in an oral interview. This old warrior had tears in his eyes, and he reminded me that he had fought hard for the Republic of Vietnam for 10 years. that he and his comrades had struggled and bled for a cause that was theirs and a cause that was ours. And then came the question, tell me, you're still in South Korea, but you left South Vietnam. What did I do wrong? What did we do wrong? I couldn't answer that question then, and after years of more research, I still can't answer it. South Vietnam fought long and hard for its independence in a war that was in part largely ours, our construction and our supply. But then we departed, leaving behind millions who had believed in us and our promises. We left behind impossible decisions, moral quandaries, and families destroyed. At the sharp end of war, abandoning Vietnam wasn't just a political or strategic issue, it was an issue of life or death. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to start off by saying that I'm glad that for once I'm not the oldest white guy on the panel. I've now started calling my dear friend Jim Willbanks Emeritus, which oddly he doesn't find as funny as I do. But anyways, later today I'm going to be talking about at a session I think at 3:30, talking about the People's Army's final campaign and how it evolved and similarities and differences between 65 and 68 and 72. So please join me then. But I think just to very quickly give you some ideas. The People's Army of 75 had learned some very costly lessons from 72, what we in the military call lessons learned. So, and in particular, the key to victory for them was the importance of staff work and contingency planning and the art of fighting in combined arms. Now, I fully realize that neither topic is particularly sexy in lieu of a fascinating tale of battlefield brilliance, but it's what enabled them to adjust quickly to rapidly changing circumstances on the battlefield. And just equally important, the Pavan armor, what little they had left, now fought together in this combined armed environment with infantry and engineering troops and air defense and reconnaissance troops. So they had learned the hard lessons of 72. But what I want to spend the few minutes I have here is really sort of discussing the South Vietnamese a little bit. The RVNAF, which is not the ARVN is just the Army, in 1975 have often been characterized in the historiography of the disastrous retreat from the highlands, or the mob panic in Da Nang, or the photographs of boots and uniforms littering the streets of Saigon, which really only happened after the surrender announcement was happened. But in truth, the South Vietnamese really fought quite well in many places. And what's funny to me is even on occasion, the People's Army acknowledges that. And if you read enough communist military histories like I have, you realize how rare that is. And I'll give you an example, one I often quote. The Pavan General Wang Dan, who was the deputy commander of their 2nd Corps, wrote about the difficult battles outside of Saigon in the last days of the war. And he wrote, and this is a direct quote, "Anyone who says we captured Saigon without breaking a light bulb should pick up a shovel and help bury our dead." So many people often ask me, what's your favorite kind of story of those last 2 months of the war? And well, the Battle of Sun Lap, and my old dear friend General Layman Dow gets all the attention. There are so many other incredible events of courage. I just wanted to highlight that many people probably won't realize. And I'm just gonna read off a few. So there was General Trang Quang Khoi's 3rd Armored Cavalry Brigade, which is actually one of the most interesting units in the South Vietnamese Army, deserves much more study. So he's having a fight on 2 fronts in March of 75 on both sides of Tay Ninh province. And as a former armor officer watching his unit bounce back and forth between these 2 fronts, I was very impressed with not only their courage and the tactics that his unit did, but the staff work and logistics that took to move around a unit like that. And so you have to sort of understand that these aren't, that the courage and what happens isn't always the parts of battle that are important. Then there was the Rangers at Trung Tan, which was a town south of An Loc, after they actually had retreated from An Loc because they were in an exposed position. And there was one reinforced Ranger battalion that was attacked by the entire Pavan 9th Division with armor. And the Rangers fought there at Chungtan for over a week and so badly damaged the PAVN 9th Division that it was combat ineffective the rest of April. Didn't even participate in the rest of the 75 offensive. Going into the Air Force, so there was Levin Tao's 93rd Air Wing at Phan Rang, which fought continuously for 45 days and was actually in the last days of the Battle of Phan Rang, was lifting off from the airport there and couldn't even get their wheels up before they were dropping bombs on the PAVN attack columns. And the commander, Levin Tao, was, and this is always sort of a fascinating story to me, he actually was rescued by one of his planes who landed on the airport to pick him up as PAVN tanks are coming in from the other end, capturing the airport. Navy ships, so many captains desperately trying to park their ships to rescue civilians and rescue people off beaches and off piers. The battle of the 6th Marine Battalion of Le Ba Bin at Honai on Route 1 after the Battle of Sunam, which held off the entire PAVN 341st Division for a couple of days. And then one of my favorite, actually my favorite ARVN unit, which is 81st Airborne Rangers, whose gallant stand at both Phuc Long and outside of Tay Ninh, Tan Son Nhut on the very last day deserves a great study. So I just wanted to mention those, but if I had to pick a favorite, and this is my favorite, is the retreat by 2 regiments of the 22nd ARVN Division from the An Khe Pass down Route 19 all the way to the beaches of Quy Nhon. I want you to think about this. They're retreating down a road. They've got a PAVN Division nipping at their heels from the west. They've got the 3rd PAVN Division throwing up roadblock after roadblock after roadblock to try and stop them. They broke through 3 roadblocks, fought their way to the beaches, loaded themselves on the beaches in good order, and left. And then the 1 regimental commander, because he felt dishonored, went back to the beach and committed suicide. That movement is a classic, and everyone who knows anything about the military, a retrograde retreat is the most difficult maneuver to do, and to do it with a division pressing on you and another division fighting your way is an impressive achievement. So I just wanted to end by saying that I know all this about writing. I wrote my book Black April because I was able to interview a lot of South Vietnamese who had took part in that, rather than using American records to talk about the South Vietnamese, which is the problem with American-centric histories of the war. So I bring up one more time the same thing I've mentioned many times before to my Vietnamese friends, as you, the South Vietnamese veterans, must tell your stories. You have to write down what happened in any battle, even as I say, if you were a sergeant in the motor pool, and what your unit did. And I mention this because there was a book published about 10, 12 years ago that my friend Zora knows by a guy named Nguyen, who was just a major in the Chu Hoi ministry. And he'd been a northerner, came south. But his book is so fascinating because he goes into details about what he learned and what he experienced, and that's the kind of thing that we need more of. And then I just want to end with this by talking about the dedication I put in my book, Black April, which was dedicated to the men and women, soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces, 1955 to 75, who stood and fought. And I thought for a long time about my dedication, and it dawned on me that we as officers who often give an order, go take that hill, then depend upon the sergeants and the enlisted men to pick up a rifle and go take that hill against men determined not to let you. And so I was trying to make a dedication to the thousands upon thousands of South Vietnamese who had stood and fought for their country and died and were badly wounded, whose names will never appear in a book like this. We'll know about the Dows and the Khois and the Le Van Taos of the world, but we'll never know about those guys. So that's the reason why I dedicated my book to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for your remarks. So we want this to be an interactive session with lots of audience Q&A and conversation. I'm going to start with a question, and I have a few more that I can ask, but after I ask my opening question, then I would like to offer the audience a chance to answer questions to our distinguished panelists. So the first question that I want to ask you guys is, okay, so the idea of abandonment means to give up. And so I wonder if you can reflect on anything else that could have been done to avoid abandonment. What were the alternatives that maybe could have been put into action?
Who's going first?
I will. Sometime after the fact, I started my Ph.D. at the age of 58. Can't recommend that. But obviously, my topic was Vietnam by default. And so I started looking at all the documentation, all the Nixon papers, and I saw all the promises that were made to Vietnam. And of course, it's all obviated by the fact that Watergate, he ends up going away in disgrace to California. Now, always in my mind, there were 2 points that I wonder about. One, why did the Paris Peace Accords not address the North Vietnamese troops left in the South? I think we had a window about midway through the Christmas bombing to perhaps get some sort of concession, but it was not pursued. And I think the other thing is the promises, 31 if I remember the number correctly, that we would be there to support South Vietnam if North Vietnam became overly aggressive, which we knew they were going to anyway. If the air support that had been there in 75, that was there in 72, perhaps it would have been a different outcome. I defer to my colleagues.
For me, I think when I teach my class on the Vietnam War, the question on the first midterm is why did we get in? The question on the second, on the final is why did we not win? And so I keep waiting for that correct answer from the students, and none of y'all have given me that correct answer yet. But I think if it was going to be a different outcome, we had to think differently much earlier. We had to trust the Republic of Vietnam much more than we did from the get-go, and there was no way to reclaim that at the end. You know, when I'm talking about this to the class, and I think in this case it helps to be a historian who looks at lots of things, not just the Vietnam War. It's really hard to admit, but I characterize it especially to a freshman class who doesn't get a lot on Vietnam. They get 50 minutes. You know, I characterize it as a war we pretty much had to enter, given the politics, the geopolitics of the time. And damn it, I can't figure out a way it could have ended any way other than it did, given the American leadership, given the foibles of us as a country at that time, given all the other stuff going on. I wish I had a more positive answer on that, but given who we were at the time, unless we started differently, I don't think it was going to end differently.
Well, before we get too deep into American self-flagellation here, let's take a step back and address my dear colleague's first point. First off, I can just tell you from North Vietnamese records, Les One was not going to pull Vietnamese troops out. He had seen what happened in '54 in Geneva, and he was absolutely, there was no way, short of physically pushing the PAVN out of South Vietnam, he would ever agree to withdrawing troops a second time. He was just not going to do it. The other thing is, we have to realize, as Andy mentioned, the time frame. I mean, there are basically 2 things that happened. One was the cutting of aid, and the second thing was the not coming back in with American firepower. So let's address the first one. The first one actually started with DOD in the summer of '73, thinking that there was going to be a ceasefire, which they could then save money by cutting. The South Vietnamese were going to need as much support, so they could start cutting the aid that we had promised them. And that began, and then you have to understand, as a very democratic anti-war Congress came in, very anti-Nixon, that the sense that South Vietnam was a military corrupt dictatorship was pervasive in the Congress. And so a lot of those votes against continuing aid were against that image. We can look at that now and question it, but that was certainly the view at that time. Then in terms of American firepower, which I think ultimately was probably as more decisive than anything, was you have to understand South Vietnam, and I'll talk about this later today, is a very difficult country to defend. You've got the DMZ, but you've got this very long western flank that's covered in mountains and jungle, which is extraordinarily difficult. You can't defend everywhere. So basically, the sequence of the war was the PAVN could mass in secret, build up logistics, attack a specific point, push them back, but then they would eventually run out of supplies, air power, mobility would come in, ARB and South Vietnamese Americans would counterattack and retake it. So that didn't happen in 75 because the South Vietnamese didn't have the fuel, it didn't have the firepower, they didn't have the spare parts, but equally important, they didn't have the intelligence to tell them what was coming, and they didn't have the firepower to defend. And that's what led to some very disastrous decisions later on.
I'd like to open it to questions. Okay, sir in the back at the table there, yes.
Excuse me, Heather, if we could real quick. So we are recording these sessions, and we need people to use the microphones when you're asking questions. In this particular session, Alex has volunteered to carry the microphone around to the audience. In the other sessions, we really need you to come up and use the microphone, otherwise your question will not be heard in the recordings. And so please make sure you use that also. We ask that you please keep your comments to a minimum and ask a question, so that we can, of course, share the microphone with other folks who have questions and wish to share their perspectives. So with that, thank you, Alex.
Anybody?
Yes, this gentleman here who's right there.
Yeah, I'm Nathan Nguyen. I'm from University of Houston downtown. I just have one comment and one question. My comment is that my father-in-law was in Special Force from 1955 to 1975. And he said they always want to go north to take care of business. But then they were never allowed to go, rather than, he always dropped his men behind the line and they got captured or killed. There was one man after the war, he came back and alive, but it was very hard to find. And he said they could have won the war with proper supply, but eventually they had to, until the end of the war, he had to hijack a boat to get out of Vietnam because he know what comes alive. Because when he was 16 years old, he was captured in the north because he's a devout Catholic with his family, so he had to escape. So the second time, he's not going to be captured again. And my question is that, you mentioned why we keep South Korea but not Vietnam. And I was thinking, my question is that when Henry Kissinger, he met with China and they were shaking hands. And at the time, the world order was that China was still a very strong support of North Vietnam, while Russia, they will still support, but they are not a strong supplier. So my question, you think that the world reorder or realignment of the power between China and the US, is that one of the reasons why the US more apt to withdraw or abandon Vietnam rather than continue that support? Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to my friend Steve Young for promoting this theory that we abandoned South Vietnam to the Chinese, which, and I love Steve, I think he's a brilliant scholar, but he and I strongly disagree on this one. There was certainly Nixon was trying to get America out of Vietnam because he wanted to he wanted to pull the American focus off South Vietnam and to move it to other places in the world. Europe, the Russians, the Chinese. But I disagree with Kissinger having to negotiate this for the South Vietnamese in principle, but he was also faced with the North Vietnamese refusal to talk to South Vietnam. So at that point, what do you do? So he continued the negotiations, hoping to get the best deal he could. And I think for most historians will recognize that the Paris Peace Accord was, and this is not probably going to go over well with a lot of people in this room, but it was probably the best bad deal he could get. You guys can attack me later, but that's what's
Could I actually weigh in on that one a little bit too? I interviewed a lot of South Vietnamese veterans of the war as well, and here both the two leading protagonists, Dinh and Huey, you brought up a very good point that in 68 post-Tet Offensive, they could not get it through their heads why we weren't chasing communist forces into their strongholds, whether they be in North Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia. They couldn't believe that a military victory would be forsaken for the sake of American protesters in the streets. They couldn't get that, and I do think that's tied into, you know, the nature of our failure in that war. And I also think that, you know, the abandonment at the end is cold, hard calculation. At the beginning, when we chose to stand up and fight in Vietnam, the calculation was that it was geopolitically worth it. At the end, it was geopolitically not worth it. And I think it comes down to those hard political decisions, correctly or incorrectly, made by our leaders at the time.
Hi, I'm Nguyen Carolyn Valverde, and I'm actually currently teaching a course, the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War and its legacy. And so the question to the panel, thank you very much, is it seems like this war is completely contested and you know, we, depending on your discipline, so you have everything from, and I'm in ethnic studies, Asian American studies, and so you have everything from talking about the Vietnam War as US imperialists and South Vietnam as a puppet regime, to, you know, speaking about the heroic, you know, battles and, you know, questions of what we could have done to win the war. So my question is, how do you teach a course, and you're teaching and talking about this topic, that gives a more broad understanding and diverse perspective of this war, to kind of give a sense that it was much more complicated than one way or the other?
I taught at the Army Staff College, which is sort of its own little bubble, 1,100 majors a year, and I taught a course on Vietnam. It is a block that all of them must take, not the elective, but at least the two lessons in the required history course. And we have to teach it in terms of what's going on geopolitically. Why do we get involved? Certainly the Cold War, in the Cold War context, to make them understand how U.S. forces were committed and how they were used, either rightfully or wrongfully. I have also taught it at the University of Kansas as an adjunct, but I'll defer to my colleague here on how to deal with civilian audiences.
I mean, it's a tough one. Historians are supposed to be unbiased, but by the mere fact we've chosen to research the subject, we've biased ourselves. In my class, we were halfway through the class before the war even starts. I mean, you have to go deep. You have to talk about cultures. You have to talk about, you know, music. You have to talk about the Great Society in America. You have to talk about an onset of a Vietnamese civil war that most Americans don't. And you have to check yourself. You've got to take yourself out of it. And you know, when I was first beginning my career, I taught World War I. That was my big thing. And it dawned on me when I kind of transitioned into Vietnam, there's a whole bunch of people alive who can still talk to my class who were in it. And I've had everybody from conscientious objectors. I had a member of the Weather Underground. I've had several veterans of all stripes, both American and Vietnamese, from both sides. And it's difficult because, as you mentioned, when I shifted over to the Vietnam War, I was really surprised to see that people in conferences almost wanted to fist fight each other. It wasn't like World War I, where things were boring and old. It was fresh and new. But also, we have to remember too that when, you know, to my students today who are taking a class on the Vietnam War, it's ancient history. I mean, people had rotary dial phones at that time. Our kids' heads explode.
Be very careful there.
Yeah, yes, I still have a rotary dial phone. It's not hooked up, but the further you get away from it, the easier it is to be neutral on it, because the students are blank slates when it comes to Vietnam. That they have no memory of it at all.
If I could just add, I'm teaching Vietnam War right now, and I start my class we start in 19th century Vietnam, but I talk to them about the Chung sisters and Le Loi and the ideas of those people as fighting for Vietnamese freedom and independence from foreign invaders. We don't get to the U.S. military intervention in Vietnam until probably halfway through the semester, because want to set up for them multiple Vietnamese contexts so that they understand that this really is about different Vietnamese viewpoints on this nation's post-colonial future that the U.S. intervenes in at different time periods in the 20th century. So,
Yeah, I'll just tag on that and say the hardest thing to American students is get them to understand this is a Vietnamese war that has a period of American involvement, and then it's still a Vietnamese war. And that blows their mind.
Good morning. My name is Michael Doe. I fought in Vietnam for 9 years as infantry officers. The first off, when we talk about American abandoned Vietnam, I think it's something involved with American politics. During that time, the Americans faced the United States faced chaos within the politics, and they overestimate the involvement of China. And the first, Vietnam is the first foreign war that United States failed to support the Allies. And I think that's the thing we should learn from Vietnam War and Afghanistan. It belongs, everything from Washington D.C. and the capital. So the more we learn about history and the Vietnam War, the less we blame Americans about, abandoned Vietnam. Not American abandoned Vietnam. The politician in capital abandoned Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you. First, Jay, a personal comment. I think you and I actually agree. In all the reading I did.
When did that happen? Because I don't remember that.
Well, actually,
Again, I'm not the oldest white guy up here, and I remember a little bit of it.
Yeah, sure, but it happened the first time when I read your book.
Okay.
Okay, so in any case, in all the things, all the secret correspondence I read from Henry, finding his files here and there on the Paris peace negotiations, I never saw any evidence that he cut a deal with China. And I do know, speaking to our Vietnamese colleagues, that there's so many Vietnamese, I've argued with them, he says, the sellout by America was to cut a deal with China. I have seen no evidence for that. Second point on this is that Kissinger first proposes the abandonment on January 9, 1971, in his meeting with Dobrynin. This is long before the sort of negotiations with China happened. But I'm just wondering on abandonment, if it'd be okay if I share very quickly an anecdote of Bui Tin and General Westmoreland. Because this abandonment goes back to Norm Hanna's book, which people may not remember, which is the 1962 agreement over Laos, which Averell Harriman sort of imposed on the Kennedy administration and the Lao and the Thai and the Vietnamese. And that opened up the Ho Chi Minh Trail for the rest of the war. So just very briefly, Bui Tin came over in 1990. He's a very influential senior communist, right? Broke with Lezuan, came over here, called me up, wanted to meet with General Westmoreland. I set it up, I translated. We're at a restaurant outside of Washington. Bui Tin sits down. Westy, who's quite elderly, is to sit down. Bui Tin cannot control himself, and he just goes, he says, General, I am here to tell you that if Lyndon Johnson had accepted your proposal to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail, you would have won the war. And Westy, hearing that, like he'd been confirmed by this former communist, he grabs the edge of the chair and kind of goes like this. But I think for those of us who are studying the Vietnam War, we should not overlook Laos and Averell Harriman.
I have a question. So one of the things that you all have talked about, and Heather, you too, because you have such a wide publishing history and background, could you maybe speak to the students in the room on what it seems like is that American historians potentially need to start looking into Vietnamese voices quite a bit more in scholarship, and that's a good path for students to take. So what can grad students do, or any scholars who want to shift in that direction, to better get at Vietnamese voices, understanding that we're now in a very constrained financial environment, a constrained research environment, that learning language is difficult. So with all of your experience, how would you suggest students potentially pursue these directions?
Well, I think to your first point, the scholarship in the last, Ed, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but the last 15 years, I would say the scholarship has gone towards more Vietnamese voices, and both North and South, probably even more so on the South Vietnamese side. So that's been ongoing, and to my earlier point, every time I speak, I encourage the South Vietnamese veterans to tell their stories, write them down in English, have them published, because once they're gone forever, and we need to capture them now. So there are banks of oral histories out there that can be used. The South Vietnamese have published enormously on the war. A lot of them is in what I call branch magazines, the Airborne, the Marines, the Air Force have all published in magazines. It's been a lot of memoirs. Certainly the communists have published extensively on the war, and some of it is translated into English. So there is the opportunity for students to access Vietnamese voices quite a bit.
Yeah, I would just say oral history, and more oral history. I mean, the survivors of this war are still out there, and better get on it quick, because our hair ain't changing colors, right? Except that we're losing it and stuff. But the veterans, in my experience, the South Vietnamese veterans can be a bit, as American veterans, can be a bit, wondering why did you call them? You have to have an entree into the community. You have to build trust. But you can call them on the phone. You can record it on Zoom. It's not expensive to do, and those stories are great.
Thank you. My name is Hai Cao. I'm an American politician. And I have two hypotheses, or could be the truth, about the Vietnam War and the title abandonment. Well, first of all, I like to borrow the terminology that my friend Stu Young used for his book, his latest book, Betrayal of Kissinger, or Kissinger Betrayal of Vietnam. Why I say betrayal? Number one, the PRG, Provisional Revolution Government, it was considered a terrorist group from my government, President Thieu. Yet, Kissinger architected the Paris Accord that we, the South Vietnam, the legitimate elected government of the South Vietnam, had to sit down and sign with the terrorist group called PRG. And the North Vietnamese, they are really terrorists because they attack aggressive South Vietnam. They got to side with the USA. How ridiculous could that be? That's one side of why I call it betrayal. The reason, the second hypothesis is that during that time, the Soviet Union, remember, back then it's still Soviet Union, is in responding to Nixon approaching to China. So they started to promote the war in the Middle East, the Egypt war against Israel. And in 1973, Israel is losing. So Kissinger needs to shift all that military support to the Middle East. And the US cannot support two wars simultaneously, one in Southeast Asia, one in Middle East. So nothing to do with the battle. My beloved country with the Army of Republic of Vietnam fought twice, proved to the Americans. The first one is the Tet Offensive, the second one is the Spring Offensive. In 1972, we fought bravely and we won. So, to me, in conclusion, Kissinger betrayal Vietnam. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Nguyen. So, it sounds from the panel that you kind of put out two major factors for the American decision to abandon Vietnam. One was Nixon's foreign policy, sort of Kissinger on one side, and then another factor was the very anti-Nixon, anti-war Democratic Congress. So I know historians don't like to engage in counterfactual questions, but I would like to ask you a counterfactual question to kind of think through these two major factors. Had Watergate not happened, had Nixon remained president, what would have been different?
Well, counterfactuals I love, actually. So, I still think, and this I have nothing but not a shred of proof on this, rather than my own opinion. I don't really think Nixon was going to come, even if Watergate had not happened, and even if the Democratic Congress wasn't looking at him, I don't think Nixon would have come back in to bomb. And the simple reason for that is he was desperately trying to prevent the reoccurrence of American POWs in North Vietnam, which is why he bombed the trail in April, because there was no SAMs down there. I think he would have been happy to support them with money and weapons, but my pure guess is that he probably would not come back in, because he was ready to move on. The country was ready to move on, and so I hope that answers your question. Are you two checking it out?
I'll add to that. I agree with you, Jay, and I think the political will in the United States was gone. The fight against communism didn't hold the same sway over a lot of Americans that it did in the 50s, maybe the early 60s. So even if there was a more hawkish Republican Congress, Nixon stayed in, I don't see that there would have been American political will to keep the conflict going.
Hi, my name is Chong Fan. My question probably is not from strategic level, but it's more tactical. I remember when I went to War College, we learned a lot from Vietnam War. And we discussed about the Weinberger theory. We basically established an exit criteria before we get into a conflict. And then we thought that we learned a lot from Vietnam War. Look at what happened in Afghanistan. So from the teaching perspective, how a nation can learn from the question whether we commit or withdraw or abandon, especially for a collective effort or for political leader of the future, so we don't make no mistake again. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll hop on that one first. I mean, I'm lucky enough to teach a whole class on warfare since Vietnam, to look at how the American military specifically dealt with what it considered to be the lessons of the war. And it's spectacular in how we choose the wrong lesson every time. When there's a way to learn from that, if we ponder the Vietnam War at all, we always seem to pick up the wrong block and somehow doom ourselves into something that's rather similar, the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, it's a whole class, it's a whole series of research projects for students, but our historical misunderstanding of the Vietnam War at the military level is staggering. But you talk that stuff to those people, what do you think?
You get no argument out of me on that. The military, the Army, I don't speak for the Army, but I was around it most of my adult life. I was an Army brat, so I guess all my whole life. Talks a good game about paying attention to history and lessons learned, but really doesn't. We don't pay attention to our own history. We're in the midst of Iraq and Afghanistan, and people are making parallels with Vietnam, and there are many senior officers who say that has nothing to do with what we're doing now, let's move on. I've taken an example. How many years, this is sort of a question I leave unopen for you. How many years did it take to come up with provincial reconstruction teams in Iraq? When the Accords model was always there. The two never met. And if you talk to the people who were putting together those teams, and I was an advisor to some of the guys who were going to be advisors on those teams, they didn't want to hear about Vietnam. because this is different. Well, it really wasn't that different. So I would submit to you a very cynical outlook, one of which, you know, on my good days I say skeptical, but really it's cynical, is that the military doesn't understand and doesn't pay attention to its own history and never has. Other than that, I have no strong thoughts.
Want to jump in with Jim there again. I had I think one of the things that, even though many of its aspects were quite good, that could have made a much bigger difference in Vietnam was our advisory effort, had it been done in a different way. And I had a student from West Point who had been an advisor in Afghanistan. And so he wanted to do his research on the advisory effort in Vietnam and the mistakes made there. And when he came in and discussed his findings, he said, you could literally take the Vietnam advisory effort, scratch out the word Vietnam, put Afghanistan in there, and we did the same exact thing again, making the same exact mistakes, having not learned a thing. And I just say that to back up Jim.
I have the same story at Leavenworth. We were standing up the counterinsurgency and the advisory effort, and the guy that was teaching the Iraq course in the Joint Department, not in the History Department, asked me to come in and talk about being an advisor. So I came in, showed my PowerPoints, talked about all the problems with being an advisor. And then the second hour was a major who had been an advisor in Iraq. He's going to talk about that. And it basically opened and it says, take his slides, change Vietnam to Iraq. Are there any questions? And that's a terrible thing to consider, really.
I want to just touch back on Nguyen Tran's question. So to reinforce what I was trying to say earlier is that if you look at Nixon's quote promises to Tew in '73, he leaves the whole point, we'll come back in if there's a major offensive with, you know, firepower. He leaves it very vague. It's very vague. He doesn't define what major, doesn't define what we're going to come back in. He leaves it very amorphous. So it was a lot of flexibility on his part. That's why again, it's a personal opinion, but I just don't see it.
Hello, thank you for organizing a fantastic conference. My name is Mary, and my dad is a colonel during the war. I came here in 1975, 50 years being in America, and I learned that the Vietnam War is lost because of the very liberal media and the politicians. And we understand that the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese army and the American military is fantastic, brave, and brilliant. They fought very well. And we understand that the Congress in 1974, when they have a majority of Democrats, and they voted not to aid South Vietnamese, so we had to fight alone for 2 years, and without, like you say, without air power. I wanted you to have a comment on this one. Mr. Bruce Hutchinson, he said that our military won the war, but our politicians lost it. The communists of North Vietnam actually signed a peace treaty already, effectively surrendering, but the US Congress did not hold up its end of the bargain. The United States knew that North Vietnam would violate accords, and so we planned for it. And we did not know was that our own Congress would violate the accords. And you know, the media, we have a liberal movement here. The Vietnamese communists, they are so violent, and they use fear to control the have terrible news from Vietnam, but the media didn't really actually record or report the truth. So I want to have you make comment about the very liberal movement in this country. They still have the pro-communist and liberal movement in America that I have learned from 50 years living here. Thank you.
I actually want to respond to that one. When I teach the Vietnam War class, it's almost hard to get across to students how dominant America was at that point. Our global spanning power was like nothing the world had ever seen. We were as dominant in the world at that point as Britain had been during its heyday of Pax Britannia. or the Romans during their period of Pax Romana. I mean, and to understand how we didn't succeed in Vietnam, even though we had that huge advantage. Yes, there's counterculture problems. Yes, there's a media bias, perhaps. Yes, there's weak politicians. Yes, but when I'm telling my students this, it has to be a symphony of stuff going wrong for a power this dominant not to assert its will in this part of the world. So I think you have to add it all together, all the little bits and pieces, because other than that, America, with our dominance, has to win in that war. And somehow we don't. It's a symphony of things going wrong.
Yeah, but I think it comes down to really a pretty simple fact. One side fighting a limited war where it puts limitations on where it's going to attack, when it's going to attack, and what it's going to use in terms of resources. And the other side is prosecuting total war, period, all instruments of power, all in. And total war beats limited war every time. Had we gone in, and once again, I hate counterfactuals. I don't even usually talk about them. But if you close the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this war dies on its own.
Right.
But we don't close the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it's a conscious decision not to do so. Until we go into Cambodia, and I would submit to you it's already too late by then. And then we send the South Vietnamese into Laos, that is doomed from the beginning because ultimately the decision, I think it was Operation El Paso, called for 4+ U.S. divisions. It just, we put limitations on ourselves and then we wonder about the outcome.
Just to make a couple quick comments. First off, Hanoi did not see the Paris Peace Accords as a surrender. They saw it as a major victory for them because they had kicked the Americans out.
Right.
So don't go down that path. The other thing is, to your point about cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that I fully agree. That was the key to victory. But what you're really talking about is the difference between strategy and non-strategy. And the American strategy, either direct or indirect during the war, versus what Hanoi's strategy is, and they call it a revolutionary war, resistance war. It's totally different, and that's the basis of why they quote won and we quote lost, is how the strategies evolved over time.
Well, we had a strategy of deployment.
We
deploy forces, we send forces there, and then we ask ourselves, what are we going to do when we get there?
Right, well, we had strategy to hold South Vietnam as an active defense, whereas they were on the offense.
Sure, absolutely agree.
I got a question for you. My name is Nguyen. I am a businessman. I got two short questions for you. Number one, you mentioned, when your comment, you mentioned about a response from General Lam to an officer, and that he is late for his tennis match. Does anybody verify that response, or is just a speculation?
When Din called him, he said Lam said he's late for a tennis match. He's asking you if that's true. Can you back that up?
Second question.
The only way I can back that up is that it was Din who told me. So you have to take the source on that. I mean, the source is a traitor who no doubt is attempting to back up his own story. But his advisor, Colonel Camper, I believe at the time, overheard the conversation and backed it up as well. So it was kind of corroborated by a more, hopefully, trustworthy source.
My second question to you is that how important is Vietnamese geopolitics now? Is it as important as it was at the beginning of the Vietnam War? Is it as unimportant as it was at the end of the war?
You're going to have to be much more specific than that.
The geopolitics is how valuable the geopolitics of Vietnam now compared to it was to the U.S. government before the war and after the war.
Where does the U.S. government see Vietnam today compared to back then?
Yeah, right.
Okay. Jim, what do you think about that question?
I was just going to sing karaoke.
Karaoke.
We're going to have to table that one, I think.
There's banana.
last days of the war, Ford and Kissinger were talking in the White House. Ford said to Kissinger, "I'm the 6th president that had to deal with Vietnam. What are the other presidents do? Or what would they have done in these circumstances?" Kissinger answered, "Kennedy would have given a great speech everybody would remember forever and ever, and nothing new would happen. Nixon," I'll rephrase it, that Nixon would have bombed the shit out of them. He was that kind of person. And I think that really was what Kissinger thought was happening and what would have happened. In asking what could have happened, and that's again counterfactual, the fact is that when MACV closed down, they set up a new headquarters in Thailand called the U.S. Army Support Group. It was not under the command of the Thomas Mac Thai. It was directly under SINCPAC. And its specific mission was to be able to respond if Nixon had said, "Let's do something." They had detailed plans, which were written up in the SINCPAC command histories, bombing targets, how you implement it, bombing at Khe Sanh specifically because of the supplies of anti-aircraft equipment that had gone to Khe Sanh, and also basically to restart Linebacker 2. And this is all written up in the SINCPAC command histories. Third point is the last DAO in his end of tour report said anytime up to 30 days before the fall of Saigon, we could have changed the outcome of the war. He went on to say that we didn't have the political will to do so, but we had, in fact, the capability on site to conduct that war. And because, unlike what had happened for all the previous years of the war, you had troops in the open. And the Air Force personnel there was just saying, "Why didn't we have this kind of target before?" It was there. We didn't do it. What happened, the loss was what we have today in the United States from not following through with our own expectations and commitments.
Steve, I'm more than well aware that on a quarterly basis, the ARVN Corps commanders will go to Thailand and coordinate bombing plans with 7th Air Force. And I'm also well aware of the SINCPAC plans, but that's what the military does. They create contingency plans in case the leadership pulls the trigger, which, you know, I understand what you're saying, but I don't see the political will in Washington. The point you're talking about in 75, yes, it was a target-rich environment. Naval gunfire would have decimated the Pavan, what they call the coastal column. They're just driving down Route 1, bumper to bumper. We could have wiped them out. Same thing on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There was divisions backed up on it. But you forget that there was also a law at that point preventing any U.S. military involvement in Indochina.
But Nixon was gone.
Doesn't make a difference. Ford was still bound by the congressional law that they can't, it was a Cooper Church, I think, Cooper Church. Bob is trying to thread a needle.
Sir, your question.
I just wanted to mention one point about several people comment about the Republicans, Democrats, and so on. During the Vietnam War, I'm sorry, can you hear me? I apologize. During the Vietnam War, it was much more bipartisan than it's been presented. For example, in the 1972 election, Nixon won by a landslide, and the Republicans picked up a number of seats in the Senate. But the number of anti-war senators actually increased because there were equal numbers of, anyway, there's mixed up numbers between Republicans who are anti-war and Democrats who are anti-war, and Republicans who were pro-war and Republicans who were Democrats who were both pro-war and anti-war. It was a much more mixed up situation than is being presented along party lines. That's modern. It didn't exist in the 1960s or 1970s. For example, on a lot of the restrictions, the Cooper Church Amendment, Senator Howard Baker in 1986 reflected his mentor in the Senate was Cooper, a Republican from Kentucky, who was a co-author of, co-sponsor of the Cooper Church Amendment, which was just mentioned. And Church was a Republican, a Democrat from Idaho. And Howard Baker took over the Senate. And he reflected in 1986 saying that he was deeply disturbed on how the United States Senate had usurped the powers of the president to end the Vietnam War. And he thought that was a very dangerous precedent by cutting off all the funding that the Senate now had assumed the war powers. In the same thing, when the votes were defeated on many of the Senate laws to further end support for the Vietnam War financially, it was the House, which was controlled by the Democrats, that would not agree to the Senate laws and voted them down. And so I'm just saying that that dynamic needs to be explored a little bit more than single party line decision.
I actually want to respond to an earlier question that was brought up, the question of Vietnam and American geopolitics today. We were just sitting here thinking about it, that, you know, and Heather's are actually the expert on this, American geopolitics and the Cold War. But just an opinion, in an incredibly Eurocentric American view of the world, Vietnam only bubbles up especially when China bubbles up as an important thing. And China appears to be bubbling up as an important thing right now, so my guess would be that Vietnam rises and falls as China rises and falls as our enemy. And with the tariff war going on right now, I suspect we're paying more attention to Vietnam than we have in a while.
Howdy, y'all. Sorry, my voice is a little gone. I want to thank you for being here. I've heard you guys speak 1,000,001 times and read every single one of your books. I think Dr. Milam has at least one, maybe two of everyone's books up there on my comps list, and I just finished that, so thanks, Dr. Milam. My conversation's a little bit more on, I just finished CAQC for Civil Affairs, my captain's career course, and there was a big conversation about the end of the Vietnam War. There was no historical analysis on it. There was just the blatant conversation. How do we teach the end better, and how do we get into these PME areas to kind of help that narrative be explored better, so officers like me kind of understand where they're supposed to be at, how we should be thinking about it, what the end actually meant for people like me doing civil affairs, advising, and stuff like that. Thank you.
We talk about conflict termination a lot, the staff college. Realize, of course, I haven't been there since 2018. I've been here in Texas and enjoying every minute of it, I might add. There's a lot of discussion about what are you trying to achieve by going to war in the first place, what have you achieved, and how do you end the conflict, and how do you leave things when you leave the battlefield. It's kind of different for every conflict, so we look at Vietnam, we look at Afghanistan and Iraq. Some hard lessons there as well. I'd say the jury's still out on that, particularly those two. We tell them over and over again, these are majors in the mid part of their career. And I would submit to you that it appears as some of them get more senior, they forget some of the things we talk about. Because you've got to ask yourself, why do you go to war? What are you trying to achieve? And what can you achieve with the resources at your disposal? And if there's a mismatch there, the end isn't going to be good.
Yes, gentlemen. I was in Saigon during the evacuation in April 1975, and I want to know during your research if you know about any agreement between the North Vietnamese and the American side not taking any offensive action for all those military there at Tan Son Nhut. Yeah, okay, see?
Go for it,
We're back on track.
Exactly, thank you. Thank you for a question I can actually answer. So, that's a great question. There were two different tracks. One is Kissinger had gone to Dobrynin, the Russian ambassador, and was trying to get the Russians to convince the North Vietnamese to give time for the Americans to evacuate. And there's a series of cables back and forth between the two. The Russians responded on April 24th to President Ford. Brezhnev responded, basically saying the Vietnamese have responded positively, and you basically have a window. At the same time, though, the People's Army around Saigon was getting ready to launch the offensive. So they weren't really getting any sort of messages, hang on for a second. Now there was something else that I was told about, which I published in Drawn Swords, which was a Chinese initiative to try to hold off the advancing North Vietnamese army. But as far as I know, nothing got down to the commanders in the South to hold off on attacking Saigon. And in fact, there's a very, very interesting comment in the air defense history is that basically they wrestled the SAM-2 all the way down the trail, get it down to outside of Saigon, put the vans up, flip the radars on, and all of a sudden they're seeing these planes circling Tan Son Nhut, and they look for orders to fire, and the deputy air defense commander says, no, we're not going to fire into this pattern. And the next line is kind of hilarious. He says, due to the incompetence and cowardice of the deputy air defense, we were held off from winning this great victory. Well, I always said to myself, you're lucky he didn't fire, because that's when the Americans would come back in and pounded their ass. So there was efforts to gain time to withdraw, not in like a disorderly manner that eventually happened, but they never came to fruition. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, yeah, we got out.
Yeah.
Okay, so please forgive my ignorance as I ask this question, and I hope it's not too much of a yes/no question. But I was kind of inspired by how you were talking about when you teach this course, you only get through to the start of the war halfway through the class, right? There's so much setup required. And I suppose I was wondering about the rhetoric of the word abandonment, comparing the 1975 to like Dien Bien Phu and the French withdrawal, the French retreat, as it's often characterized in that sort of way. So I guess I'm wondering, is the way that the word abandonment typically isn't used in that case because of the sort of baggage of 100 years of French colonialism, or what's the sort of view taken about like the end or the French withdrawal in conversation or in comparison to the Americans?
Yeah, I would argue the French withdrawal is, it's decolonization. It's a victory for the colonized. The French aren't abandoning it. They're rightfully whipped in it as a European aggressor. The American situation in South Vietnam as an ally, not a colonizer, is, I would argue, quite different. That although of course there are elements of imperialism there, that is certainly something you have to think about when you think about the American involvement in the war. But our relationship with the Vietnamese who are trusting us is different than the relationship with the French, even though of course there were Vietnamese, the VNA, that trusted and worked with the French. So the more I talk about it, the more complicated it gets.
Hi, my name is Mark Gilbert. I've attended virtually every one of these from the beginning. Thanks to Jim Reckner. Thanks to this particular panel, which I think, because the next panel, hopefully the next meeting, will be in Vietnam. And maybe it might be better than this. But from what I've seen of the program and this particular panel, I don't think it's ever started as well. And I'm sure because of the efforts of all of you, it's going to be the best yet. And I am very grateful to having had this opportunity. The only comment I would make, because it's just about the American war issue, most of us may have forgotten that George Ball wrote a memo in 1965 saying that we would fight 5 years in Vietnam, we would lose 50,000 killed, and we'd leave with our tail between our legs. And I believe it was George Bundy and William Bundy and McNamara were the only people who vetted this memo. But what's important was the answer that the Bundys gave, which is George may be right, but we've never lost a war. And if it goes badly, we can just pull out. And that speaks to Professor Wiest's comment about the mindset. I'm afraid that mindset's really, now in Afghanistan and in Iraq, it's the mindset, but it's a mindset that, as you've mentioned, of a colonial power. And we haven't outgrown that yet. And I'm grateful to hear so many different opinions that have addressed that in different ways. Thank you again for this panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for all of your comments, your questions. Thank you very much to our distinguished speakers today. We're out of time. This is the end of this session. I so appreciate everyone being here and look forward to seeing you at the remaining sessions the rest of this weekend. Thank you.